Welcome to episode 10 of the Liz McMullen Show. My author guest this evening is Radclyffe, and this is the second in my series on gender and sexuality. The focus for this episode is going to be characterization. Hi, Rad. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Liz. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So how's the year going so far? Any new books on the horizon?
Well, I just finished one that was published in November. That was Crossroads, medical romance. And I have a new one coming out in March, part of my paranormal romance series. This one is The Lone Hunt. It's the fourth in the Midnight Hunters series. So that's due for release in the middle of March. And I am 3 chapters into my July release, which is Code of Honor.
Ooh, from the Honor series. You know, one of the things that I find really exciting about your books is how often characters from some standalone Zen series kind of pop up in the same places.
That actually was an accident. It wasn't anything I had ever planned to do, but I had read a mystery series by George Pelecanos, who writes a detective series set in, I'm going to say Baltimore, but it might be D.C. Forgive me if I'm wrong on that. But at any rate, his was the first works that I had read where 2 characters from separate series came together. And I thought that was such a cool idea. Both these guys lived in the same city and presumably at the same time. So when I was writing the Justice series, it occurred to me that I could cross over with some characters I had already put into the same city who had kind of similar jobs. And I just decided to try it. And it was so much fun and it was so well received, I started to do it a lot more.
I know. I love it. And I think as, you know, a voracious reader, we really get attracted and attached to characters that we love. And then you get sad because the book has to end.
I know. I am, no surprise, I'm sure you know, primarily a romance writer. And romances generally, traditionally end at the end of a single book when the romantic journey is over and the 2 characters can have decided that they will go forward in life together. And that doesn't really leave a room for a sequel in most instances. So even though we love these characters and we want to see more of them, ordinarily the story's done at the end of a book when you're writing a romance. And I wanted to try to continue the characters in some way in some of these books. So I started introducing new characters and expanding on the world in which they lived so I could bring the older characters back. And that's been working pretty well in most of my series. I generally tend to do them that way.
Yeah, I like when things get pulled on, like sex and...
Yeah.
And also Honor and Quinn pop up in a lot of different books. And for me as a reader, it's like, oh, this is a real place because other people in the same city are bumping into each other on the soccer field or in the hospital and whatnot.
Yeah, I recently did another blog about community as a character because I really sort of think of that. The community that these characters inhabit almost as a character itself. It's something that's recognizable to the reader. It has a life of its own. It tends to grow and change. Mm-hmm. And as we add new people, the community becomes more and more a part of the book as opposed to just a backdrop for the story. And I've been playing with that a lot. And that's why when I sit down to write a new book, when I wrote Crossroads, for example, mm-hmm. I had envisioned it as a standalone romance, but when I sat down to write it, I had to put them in a hospital somewhere because it was a medical romance, and it just was perfectly natural to put it into a hospital that was positioned in one of the previous books. So it ended up actually being a spin-off.
Yeah, and what I find interesting is what a hotbed the barbecues at Linda's house are. It seems like everybody who's going to hook up in a love, romance is going to hook up at one of those barbecues.
Well, you ever been to one of those barbecues?
I would love to visit one of those barbecues. They sound like fun.
Well, the community that's I wrote about in Crossroads and Fated Love and Night Call, I actually lived there. And so when I was writing it, I was living like 3 blocks away from the area that I was really writing about. And that was very much my experience. You play softball on the weekends and then you have barbecue afterwards.
That's so cool because, all these pivotal moments, like when Tristan sees Jet pull, I'm blanking on the name of the other character, around the other side of the train, starts to kiss her. And that's the moment when Tristan's like, I wish I was on the other end of that kiss. And for Honor, they're putting up, I guess, a little wind chime. And that's when they have that kind of brush up against each other. So it seems like those barbecues are quite the aphrodisiac.
Well, it's always a challenge, I think, to bring your characters together in a setting which is believable, but which isn't so kind of mundane as to be boring. I think that finding the balance in fiction between what's real and what works in a work of fiction is a real challenge. And in that particular set of books, that community is really pivotal for me being able to write those books, because that's how I bring the characters together, is that community, that communal life that people share. They ride to work together. Their kids go to school together. They bump into each other in the park. And if you don't have a natural setting where your characters can come together, then you can't create the kind of tension that helps you develop the romance.
I agree with you on the community thing as well. It creates a natural I'm bumping into you thing, or, one of the interesting things in Crossroads was when Dr. Hollis and Annie Colfax, get called in for the same patient while they're having somewhat tense discussion about how midwife versus OB-GYN are going to work together.
And, that is actually, in my opinion at least, a totally natural occurrence, because physicians and healthcare professionals share patients in the sense that no individual's care is ever solely the responsibility of one healthcare practitioner anymore. So it makes sense to me that in an emergency situation, you'd have various consultants coming together. And, again, I wasn't making up that community, and that hospital is right smack dab in the middle of one of the large gay and lesbian communities in Philadelphia, Westmount area, and Germantown. In fact, it was kind of the impetus for me to write that whole series, so I could place the hospital in that community. So, I thought that scene, at least for me and my experience as a physician, was perfectly realistic. But it also made it easy for me to get them together at an important time.
Could you give just a brief summary of Crossroads? Well,
it's a romance, and it primarily focuses on the two main characters are Dr. Hollis Monroe, who's a high-risk OB-GYN doctor, and Annie Colfax, who is a nurse midwife. And they have a little bit of history, which I won't go into in great detail, but they met under critical circumstances 4 years prior to the time the book takes place. So there's a little bit of a backstory that puts them at odds personally. And they are also at odds professionally in that they have never worked together before. In fact, Hollis, the physician, is not opposed to the concept of nurse midwives, but is opposed to actually practicing in conjunction with anyone other than a physician when she's dealing with these high-risk patients that she deals with. So she has a little bit of a prejudice there. And Annie, likewise, has a little bit of prejudice in the opposite direction. So they are at personal and professional odds, but are ordered pretty much to work together by their superiors. So that's how they come together. And Annie has a young child, and she's making her way in the world after having left a restrictive religious community where she was raised. So she's been severed from all of her support. Her parents don't recognize her. She's lost the community in which she's grown up. So she's very much alone in the world and is very determined to make it on her own. So that's kind of her personal backstory. And it goes on from there as they share experiences together and learn to see each other in different ways.
Yeah, I felt the tension between the two characters. That Annie has a hard time trusting people with good reason because she came from a restrictive community, which obviously made her be much more sheltered than somebody who would, grow up amongst, everybody else in a city or even a small town. And Hollis, on the other hand, doesn't want to care about somebody because somebody that she cared about very, very deeply was taken away from her suddenly, and she's figured out the easiest way for her to cope is to focus on her job and keep things very light and distant, and then she doesn't have to worry about being hurt again. So Annie doesn't want, to be made a fool of for trusting somebody she shouldn't. And Hollis doesn't want to invest herself in a relationship because she doesn't want to risk, hurting herself again.
Well, I'm really, really happy because at least now I know one reader understands my book. Because you got it perfectly. I mean, when I was thinking about character this morning and how one creates character, and there are lots and lots of ways that would-be writers and writers talk about and are advised to create character. And I think all of the ways that people are advised probably work. One of the really popular ones is take your character to dinner and kind of ask the questions like, what was your life like? And where'd you go to school? And what's your favorite food? And I never do any of that. Mm-hmm. But the thing that I do and the thing that I suggest to authors is that if you're going to write a book which focuses on two individuals developing a relationship, and particularly a love relationship, as you would in a romance, you have to know, starting out, what it is that prevents them from being successful at intimate relationships. Mm-hmm. And usually it's a wound of some kind. That's the simplest way to think about it. Something happened to them in the past which has altered the way they relate to people on a deep, intimate level. And I think that's the thing you need to know when you sit down to write one of these books. So for me, you summed it up completely. That's what I envisioned for Hollis and Annie. That was the interpersonal conflict. And then the backstory flows from that, mm-hmm. because you basically, what happened to them, and you work that into the story as you write. And those are the things that has to heal for them in order to have realistic romance at the end.
I've gotten, I'd say for the last 5 years or so, I've been very interested and ensconced in reading lesbian fiction, almost to the point where I'm so accustomed to all the characters being lesbians, which obviously is not real life. But at least to some kind of questions. I mean, some straight people, when they ask about lesbian relationships, they ask, who's the guy? Mm. And the answer is always, there is no guy. They don't want there to be a guy. It's two women. They want to be together. But what I do still find when there are pairings, there tends to be one person who appears more masculine and one person who appears more feminine. And then you figure out how that parlays into the kind of jobs that they hold, the way that they relate to other people, and their approaches towards intimacy. And so there's still, what I think is true is that the dichotomy between, masculine and feminine is not tied to whom you're interacting with, whether it's a lesbian relationship, a gay relationship, or a straight one. There's that spectrum of interest from those who like to be very rough and tumble and are much more physical in their life and the jobs they choose, and then there are those who are a little bit more removed, and et cetera. But I wonder, what do you think about when you're creating a character? It just comes out of you, or how do you think about these kind of things?
Yes and no. I agree with you completely. I think that it doesn't really matter if you're writing a straight romance or a lesbian romance or a gay male romance. There has to be polarity between the characters. Mm-hmm. If you follow, and it's easy if you're writing, let's just say a lesbian romance, to have what we call character confluence if you're not thinking about it, because you're going to write two women. And right away, you've got physical, they've had the same parts, okay? So you've got a physical similarity. And what happens, I think, sometimes is that authors end up writing two characters who are so much alike that there's no chemistry. Mm-hmm. And I think that in life, there's what creates chemistry is difference. Mm-hmm. And I think that difference permeates just about every aspect of an individual, including their sexuality, and how they express themselves, how they conceive, how they picture themselves. To make it really simple for me, I tend to write butch femme pairings. And now it's interesting because lots and lots of my readers say they don't see that in my books, which always interests me because to me it's really obvious. But it's mostly phenotypic, meaning that my characters tend to be physically polarized a little bit. One clearly, you generally tell that one is a little bit more butch than the other one in appearance. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't translate to their emotional makeup. The way you used to think about, if you talk about butch femme in a classic sense, there were really clear dividing lines between how a butch lesbian, quote unquote, should act and how a femme lesbian, quote unquote, should act. And we're talking about half a century ago. Mm-hmm. And the physical disparities were matched by emotional disparities. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that's good or bad. I'm not casting judgment. I'm just saying that was what was fairly traditionally experienced. And I, experienced that myself. So mm-hmm. I know that was true. And in my books, I don't think that there's a total parallelism between butch appearance and butch sexuality or butch emotions. I think there's much more of a blending. So for me, there's more of a gender blending between the two characters.
Well, two characters that pop out in my head immediately are Sloane and Michael mm-hmm. from A Matter of Trust. Uh-huh. And initially, Sloane's running late and looks at the profile and sees that it's Michael and assumes that it's a guy, but it's not. It's a woman. But not only is it a woman, but it's like Grace Kelly meets that
is one of my butchest and feminist pairings, probably.
Really? But what I found interesting about Michael was, even though from appearance she looks more feminine, she has a much more remote, she doesn't relate to people as easily. Mm-hmm. She's really in her head, her specialty are her ideas. And her husband at the time blamed her for cheating on her because she was so frigid. And then you see her interaction with Sloane, and she's not frigid.
Well, part of it for me in that book, I don't often write characters who have had no previous sexual experience with women, although I've done it. And for me, it was really important that I show her coming to awareness of being a lesbian as an awakening and a claiming of her true sexuality. And I think that's part of the reason that I wrote her as aggressively as I did, mm-hmm. because I really wanted to show her celebrating coming to herself, coming into herself. Because for me, discovering or becoming aware of or simply kind of owning one's sexuality is a cause for celebration. And that's what I wanted to show.
I liked it. And, I could even easily, change it into a straight book where it's not about Michael, finding out that she likes women. She's attracted to Sloane. Sloane could be a man. But the reason why I say that, it's more an awakening of like herself, seeing herself as, not just a sexual being, but somebody who has more depth than she imagined she had in the first place. And it doesn't matter who turns her head to illuminate that or whatever internally illuminates that. But that was her arc. That was her growth.
Yes, I agree. Although, obviously, I wrote it as a lesbian romance. So it is obviously about her awakening sexuality, but her sexuality is not neutral. Mm-hmm. Meaning that if Sloane were a guy, she would not have had the same response. Because that's where I come from. For me, sexuality is not a choice. It is who we are, and that's who she was. And that's part of the reason why when she was married to a man, she really wasn't able to be herself completely.
Oh, okay.
It kind of took a woman for that for her to be able to open up completely on every level.
I can see that too. But you do have a Butch on Butch pairing, which I'm very fond of, in Night Call.
Mm-hmm. And Shadowland.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes. One of my favorite books as well. I like to read that a lot. And it's Dane and Kyle. Yeah.
That's true. And in Night Call, that was very intentional. I just felt like doing it because I thought it would be fun, and the two characters lent themselves really well to that. They were both, for me, they were both kind of action heroes, even though one was a doctor and you don't think of them as being, kind of action-oriented, but they were both flying all around the place, and they were both emotionally kind of sheltered and inhibited a little bit. They were both sexually aggressive, and it was just fun to make them I wanted to do a Butch on Butch pairing, and
but there's still the physiological differences between them now that I think about it.
Sure.
Like Jet was, wiry and very tightly packed muscle, whereas I remember Tristan was saying if she didn't run regularly, she had the potential to become bulky rather than, muscular.
Yeah, it's really important to find as many distinguishing characteristics as you can, especially when you're writing two same-sex people, because otherwise the reader's going to get confused and won't be able. It's so easy if you're writing a man and a woman. You only have to describe them once. You've got the different pronouns throughout the book, so there's no question who's talking or who's touching, because you've got the he and the she to make the distinguishing points. But when you've got two women, you don't have any of that. So it's really important, I think, that they be physically different, as well as have different language and dress differently, and all of the other things, obviously. Otherwise, readers can't tell who's doing what.
I can definitely relate to that. And also, they have different ways of carrying themselves, and they have different hang-ups or concerns about sex. Like Tristan tends to have, a few girls that are in her little black book that she can call and hook up with. But she never really connects with these people and never thinks that she would ever connect with anybody. She doesn't consider herself special. Mm-hmm. And that was one of the tensions with Jet. Jet's like, how could you think that you're not like your sisters? You're beautiful and talented and sexy. And she's just like, eh. Whereas Jet, she's afraid to fully express herself because she feels like what she wants sexually is too aggressive, and she doesn't want, so she kind of inhibits herself that way. And it reminds me a little bit of Xena Conqueror fiction, where
that's interesting. Yeah.
Where like Xena is afraid to express herself completely sexually. With the Gabrielle character, she's afraid that she'll go too far, or it will be too dark, or, she'll be out of control and do something that she wouldn't want to do to Gabrielle.
Well, I think that, that's the core conflict in that particular relationship, or those two relationships that you drew a parallel between. And that's how each character helps the other become more of themselves, more comfortable with themselves, more accepting of themselves, more able to express themselves. And I think that that's the whole purpose of writing a romance, is not just to satisfy the reader's desire to experience kind of the discovery of love and the awakening of intimacy, but also to show how being loved actually helps us to become more of ourselves. Mm-hmm. And so I think that what you pointed out is exactly right. Those things that are difficult for Tristan and Jet are what they overcome through the course of the book by being together.
Exactly. Tristan's like, there's nothing that you've done to me that is not okay by me.
Yeah.
There's nothing that you could do that would upset me. Basically trying her best to get Jet to completely be herself and to express herself and know that like she's not going to be rejected for wanting too much. Well,
and what greater love is there than to say to someone, there's nothing you could do or say or be that would be too much for me. Mm-hmm. Who you are is everything you are is what I want.
Exactly. So how does this parlay into writing about wares and vampires?
Well, it's really interesting because all my life, I really loved sci-fi fantasy and read a lot of it when I was a kid. And paranormal romances really didn't exist, at least very commonly, in popular fiction until the latter part of the last century. And then, boom, it really exploded everywhere, but not so much in gay and lesbian fiction. And I didn't think I would ever write it because it's really hard, you have to introduce another element, a whole new kind of universe, new types of characters with different body types and different physiology and all that sort of stuff. But finally, I don't know what happened, but I just decided one day I would give it a try. And for me, writing about the paranormal characters is great fun because I don't have any rules at all. There are no boundaries. There is nothing that says they can't have this kind of sexual response. They can't do this in bed. They can't want this. They can't be, too aggressive or too possessive or too territorial or too anything. Mm-hmm. Because basically they can be anything you want as long as you've created a consistent world that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was very freeing that I can write these, super sexual, super aggressive characters and still write about love and commitment and loyalty and all of the things that are important in my books to me.
The framework for the wares, and I have to say, majority of the time when you're reading a paranormal story, it's usually lauds the vampire characters and like the psychosexual interactions in the thrall. And one of the things that really was exciting to me was that the Midnight Hunt had the leads being the wares. Mm-hmm. And not only were you introduced to their kind of very animalistic, very intense characters, but there was a social system that made their community work. And that took precedence over, not so much appearance, but, okay, here's the alpha. She makes all the decisions. And instead of what would balk for me, because I wouldn't want somebody making all the decisions for me, I'd be like, I don't know if, she does do a good job of doing that. Or they're all up in each other's grill. That's terrible. No, they need to be together. That's a part of how they feel whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, when I got ready to write this, before I always envisioned that the wares would be probably the predominant characters. I really like vampires, but the vampire mythos is really, really ingrained in fiction and film, and not so much with wares. And I love vampires, and I really like my vampire characters, but I was much more interested in the extended social structure that I could create with the wares. And before I started writing I watched as many documentaries on wolves as I could find to see how they actually lived in the wild and how they related to the alpha. And I got this great book that was all photographs of a wolf pack. And you could see the alpha and how the alpha signaled dominance to the other wolves and how they treated their pups. And so that I had those pictures in my mind, and I really worked with that a lot in creating their social structure and how, you know, they have to touch each other, and how Sylvan signals her dominance, and how the other, how her wolves signal to her that, you know, she's their leader and they accept her leadership. But even the wares that I've written who are not dominant, they're still, none of them are pushovers.
No.
You know, they're all important. They all have a critical role. They are not afraid. Well, they may sometimes be afraid to speak their minds, but they generally do. So I wasn't really trying to create a hierarchical society in which some individuals totally controlled the lives of the others, because it is voluntary. I mean, they could leave, but if they did, they'd suffer. Because, again, we're talking about community. We're coming back to community again. And I don't think there's anything more intense than the community that I've created in this series for the wares.
Yeah, the community that is created is not pathological. They're not predators who go out and, you know, scratch somebody or bite somebody and turn them.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. That was really, really important to me. In my series, in this world, none of the quote-unquote others, whether they're wares or vampires, they are not diseased. They're not abnormal. They didn't catch something. They're simply different species who evolved millennia ago. You know, if you think about, you know, the evolutionary tree and where we all came from and all that stuff, well, there are branches on the evolutionary tree. They have as much right to live as the humans. There just aren't very many of them. And so that was really important to me, that they are normal in the sense that they are who they are. They're a valid species.
Which is, you know, the part of the mythology of the series is that up until a certain point, all the Praetorian species were kind of undercover. Mm-hmm. And then Sylvan Mir, who's the alpha, her father had decided to, you know, try and be part of the mainstream society, get rights and protections. And many folks were not into that transition. But it goes along with what you were saying, that, you know, we're just another species. Mm-hmm. And you create it so strongly, and it's such a healthy thing. They're a healthy community, the wares, that when somebody's experimenting on humans, giving them were fever that could turn them, that is more appalling once you understand that that's just not the way that the were community works. You don't go out and turn people. You don't expose others to illness. That's something that's not okay.
Yeah, I think sometimes, you know, I probably give the humans a bad rap in this series. And I've actually, in the Lone Hunt in particular, I've brought in some human characters who are actually on the side of the preterns and who are supporting the wares. And because, you know, I didn't want to have it completely unbalanced. But, you know, point of fact is, in the world that we live in currently, humans haven't always been particularly careful of what they've done to other species, which is why we have so many extinct species in the world. And I'm not, you know, I don't like to create a platform in my work for anything, but, you know, there are things that matter to me. And in this particular instance, I think it's a fairly natural extension of what we've experienced in human evolution, that humans aren't always particularly careful of those that are other, mm-hmm. Whether it be other species or other forms of sexuality or whatever the case may be. So that's kind of like what's at work, mm-hmm. on the undercurrent in this series, I think.
So Lone Hunt is the next one up that you were going to have published in the series, and you are going to do a reading for us, correct?
Yes. Are you ready for me to do that now?
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of a background before you start the reading?
I can. And if I'm lucky, I'll actually be able to find it. There it is. So the way I put this series together, I originally envisioned it as a set of individual paranormal romances that were set in the same universe, in the same world. And as it's evolved, that's how it's come about, in the sense that each book, there is a romance that threads through the book, but it also has an overarching storyline that is basically, to kind of distill it down into several sentences, is that the non-human species, of which there are 5 predominant species, the weres and the vampires, the fae, the psi, and the mages, or the sorcerer types. We haven't seen very much of the last 3, but they have all banded together, and they've come out to the world and said, we're here, we've been living, undercover for millennia, and we've been part of your world, but you didn't know we were here, and we want to be recognized, and we want to be able to live openly. And there is obviously consternation around the world as to what to do, now that everyone knows that there are these other species living kind of in society but apart from society. And should they have the same rights as everyone else? Should they be feared? Are they dangerous? And then, of course, there are the very militant, aggressive humans who don't want anyone other than humans to have any rights, and they're very opposed. So we've got a conflict between the humans and the non-human species that threads through each book. And in the Lone Hunt, this is book 4, what's happened to date is that the weres, who are basically the primary were species, are the wolves. They're the most prominent. And Sylvan Muir is the werewolf alpha. She has discovered that humans have been experimenting on some of her wolves in an attempt to figure out exactly what's causing the weres to, what is it that makes the weres, in order to either sterilize them to prevent them from procreating, or perhaps to subvert what makes them weres to be able to control them. And so she's trying to find out who's behind this. And that's kind of the motivation that's moving through each of the stories. And what happened in the last book is that someone attempted to kill Sylvan, assassinate her, and one of her guards, who are called Centuri, got in front of her, as was her job, and was killed instead. And rather than let her die, Sylvan asked one of the vampires to turn her, so that the guard's name was Lara, so that Lara would not die. And so she was turned. So Lara, who was previously a wolf were, has been resurrected as a vampire, and now she's a little bit of both. And she represents, for me, the individual who has no place in the world because she doesn't fit anywhere. She's no longer aware, and she's not really a vampire, and she doesn't know where she belongs. And so this book, The Lone Hunt, features her as a primary character and another character that she meets who will be her romantic interest. And what I'm going to read today is from chapter 3, which is the first meeting between Lara and a cat were, who is a new character that's being introduced in this book. Her name is Raina. And this is chapter 3, and as I was reviewing it right before you called, I realized it's a fair amount of narrative, but it gives a picture of this world because both of the characters are actually in animal form when they meet. And just to talk a little bit about that, when in animal form, these characters have the same mentation, more or less, that they do when they're in what we would call skin or flesh. And basically, they can still think and they're still aware, but they basically also are in their four-legged form. So that's what, if you can think about that as I'm reading this, Lara is a wolf and Raina is a cat, a mountain lion, and they're going to meet in this scene. And Lara has just left Jody Gates's townhouse. Jody is a vampire, and she is a very high-ranking vampire, and she has made Lara her warlord. So Lara is basically indentured to Jody. She is in charge of all of Jody's forces, but she's also subject to Jody's whims. She doesn't like that very much. And Sylvan Muir is the wolf alpha, so you will hear her referenced. And I believe those are the only characters. So you ready for me to read this?
Please do.
Okay. Lara emerged from Jody's lair and headed toward the river, skirting the edges of Washington Park. The park was crowded with late-day dog walkers and parents pushing strollers. Keeping to side streets and alleyways, she slid into the shadows whenever a passerby gave her more than a cursory glance. Humans saw what they expected to see. A four-legged, furred creature with a tail and a canine face was a dog, despite her wolf's larger-than-average size. She was faster than a dog, more agile, and unlike dogs, able to assess and strategize as well on four legs as she could on two. Her wolf wanted to run, to hunt, and knew where she needed to go. Within minutes, she'd reached the banks of the Hudson and turned north. The land bordering the river as it wended into the Adirondack Mountains was largely undeveloped, edged by woods, prime farmland, and the occasional waterfront summer cottages. Farmhouses sat well back from the river, above the floodplains where the river dumped its rich silt when it overran its banks after a heavy rain or spring snow melt. Trails, deer, fox, wolf, and cat, threaded through the woods and pastures, invisible to most humans, but as familiar to Lara as the highways she traveled by car. She ran as she never could in skin, her limbs stretching to the rhythm of the earth rippling under her paws, her mouth open, tasting the air, the trees, the undergrowth, absorbing the world through her pores, clear and clean, and no artificial barriers to isolate her. Her wolf, unleashed after weeks of pain and imprisonment, ran with an unfettered joy and fierce desire for freedom. Every instinct drove her north toward packland, toward home. Home, but no longer sanctuary. The compound, the Alpha's walled haven in the heart of packland, was closed to her. She had petitioned for her freedom, asked to be released from her oath to the Alpha in order to serve Jody, and the Alpha had granted her request. She was no longer the Alpha's centuri. She was Jody Gates's warlord. Although she hunted in pelt, she was more than wolf, more than were now. And she skirted the borders of packland, the hundreds of acres of dense virgin forest patrolled only by a network of were sentries. A doe crossed her path, hesitated at the scent of the predator close by, and with a wild roll of her eyes and flick of her snowy tail, bunched her muscles and bounded deeper into the forest. Lara's wolf took notice but didn't give chase. She wasn't hungry. Her blood didn't rise to the call to hunt. Confused but unprotesting, her wolf let the deer go, and she pushed on. Acid burned in her muscles, breath scoured her lungs. Her tongue lolled, her chest heaved, and still she ran, desperate for freedom, wild to purge the pain that lacerated her heart. Weak sunlight filtered through the trees, thinning filaments of gold that laced her pelt as she passed in and out of shadow. Fingers of heat trickled through her fur, but she did not burn. Just as the fire she'd driven through to rescue the Alpha and the Liege had failed to touch her, the sunlight now had no effect on her. Lethal to vampires, the UV radiation seemed powerless to damage her. Not were, not vampire. She didn't fear true death, but death refused to claim her. She stopped once by a stream, coursing down a ravine to drink cool, clear mountain water from a shimmering pool. An owl hooted from deeper in the forest. Rabbits and squirrels rustled in the underbrush, and once she scented a whisper of wolf. one of the sentries on patrol guarding the Alpha's land. The dark, spicy aroma of pack teased her senses, stirred an answering surge in her cells. Ignoring the call, she struck off again, staying downwind of the sentry's location. She wasn't sure of her welcome. A dominant wolf on pack land. She was an ally, perhaps, but no longer of the pack. Her presence might be seen as a challenge to the Alpha, and if challenged, the Alpha would show no quarter. That was the law of the pack. Lara had not come to give challenge, and soon she would have duties elsewhere. Jody would rise at sunfall and feed, first from her consort Becca, and if the injuries she'd sustained in the raid on the human labs were not totally healed, she would feed from Zahn or another of her human servants. The warlord needed to be there when Jody was ready to convene her forces. Lara was not a guard, but still, all Jody's soldiers, human and vampire alike, were hers to command. She would not have left the lair, even for her wolf's fierce need, if she thought Jody might be in danger. In the last few minutes of daylight, she climbed an escarpment, scrabbling over loose rocks, pushing through underbrush, struggling to reach the pinnacle, needing to see the forest stretching endlessly before her, longing for a glimpse of the majesty that had always been her home. Crouched on a boulder on the very edge of a cliff, she watched the sun set and the moon rise, twin hearts destined to share the universe, always separated as they passed on the edges of the day. The first glimmer of moonlight silvered through the gray twilight, and Lara's blood stirred at last. She raised her head and howled, pierced by the primal beauty. Her cries tumbled into the river valley below, echoed to her, mournful and solitary, from the mountain peaks surrounding her. When silence was all that remained, she padded down the steep slope the way she had come. If she ran all the way back, she would reach Jody's townhouse only a little after full nightrise. As she skirted the underbrush toward the water, a sound sliced the still air. Hackles rising, she stilled, her ears pricked, her nose testing the air. She'd heard the cry of a cat. The Catamount Catwares territory was a few miles to the east, and occasionally their raiding parties forayed into pack land. In pelts, the cats resembled huge mountain lions, tawny gold coats, 4-inch canines, thick muscular haunches, and powerful shoulders. More feral than wolves, the cats were sworn enemies of the wolf wares. The cats had never been well organized, and as a result of their infighting and lack of united presence, had never been considered much of a threat to pack security, which explained why Sylvan had not wiped them out. But the Alpha's leniency only extended so far. Cat hunting parties were known to attack wolf young and solitary soldiers, and the standing order to all wolves was to attack on sight and attack to kill. Lara hunkered down and slunk through the underbrush in the direction from which she'd heard the sound. The wind had shifted, and she scented nothing she couldn't recognize, no foreign markings that didn't belong. She swung her head from side to side, but heard nothing unusual. Sound carried in the mountains, yet was just as easily distorted and redirected. She might be chasing a ghost, but she needed to be sure. She might not be Centauri, might not even be a wolf, but her duty remained. She would not turn away from an enemy. The riverbank narrowed into a rocky stretch bordered by a steep cliff crisscrossed with narrow ledges, outcroppings of scraggly underbrush, and jumbled piles of boulders. Narrow crevices seamed the rock face, providing perfect cover for attack from above. Lara slowed and scanned the lengthening shadows. She perked her ears, heard nothing. Raised her muzzle, sniffed the damp air. Nothing. Across the water, another owl hooted. She flicked her ears. Perhaps that's what she'd heard. She padded forward slowly, searching. A small shower of stones trickled down the slope. One bounced off her shoulder. She froze. Something moving above? She could see nothing, scent nothing. But instinct told her she was not alone. She crouched, eased forward. One step, another. A screech of fury sliced the air sharp as a blade. Lara froze an instant that cost her as a crushing weight landed on her back and slammed her to the ground. Rocks scraped her muzzle gouged her chest. Jaws clamped onto her neck, teeth tore through the muscles of her shoulder, claws raked her flanks. Pain exploded in a dozen places at once. Lara growled, claws slashing and canines snapping. Unable to reach the vulnerable belly or throat, she rolled to dislodge her attacker. The beast rode her back, limbs wrapped around her shoulders and hindquarters, shaking and twisting her neck in powerful jaws. Fire roared through Lara's chest, rained down her back, and she snarled and thrashed. Her wolf was a seasoned fighter, and now she was more than wolf, stronger, faster. Spinning with vampire speed, she caught a leg in her mouth and locked her jaws, twisting and tearing. Warm, rich, potent blood filled her mouth. Her clitoris tensed, her sex filled, her teeth met bone. Another scream tore through the night, and the pressure on her neck relented. Her hind legs made purchase on the stony bank, and she levered her body into a sharp curve, snapping the bone between her jaws. Claws tore through her side, slashed through muscle, and she released the leg, snarling wildly. She arched her back and the weight disappeared. Spinning quickly, she faced her attacker. A huge mountain lion, ears pinned back, green eyes nearly black with rage, screamed a challenge. She was a beautiful beast, sleek and muscled, her jaws wide, lethal canines gleaming, covered in blood, Lara's blood. Lara was smaller, but quick. She leapt, hungry for blood, primed for the kill. She buried her teeth in the cat's throat, pressing her body close to the cat's underside. If she exposed her belly to the churning limbs and deadly claws, the cat would tear her innards from her and rip out her throat while she strangled on her own blood. A cat this big might even be able to kill her, but not today. Today, the kill was hers. Lara squeezed the cat's windpipe close and dug her claws into the cat's sides, tethering herself, refusing to be dislodged, even as the cat screamed and rolled, thrashing, slashing, a whirlwind of furious power. But even the strongest enemy could not fight forever without air. Lara's belly burned, her shoulder gushed blood, but she held on. The cat grew weak, fell, and didn't ride. How triumphantly Lara struggled the prone form, shaking the cat's giant head in her jaws. Her sex pulsed, verging on release. Her belly quivered, tight with need. She sensed the cat's heartbeat slowing, tasted the life leaching from the blood that poured down her throat. Another few seconds, and she would have her kill. Another few seconds, and a foreign sound cut through the fury of her bloodlust. A weak cry, thin and forlorn. Lara stilled, listened. The cry came again, was joined by another. Lara released her hold on the cat's throat, raised her head, peered into the darkness. Another shape materialized, coming fast, silently, another wolf. Lara sprang off the cat and crouched beside the bloodied, motionless body, facing the intruder. She growled a warning. Her kill, hers. The wolf, a slender gray and white female, hesitated, ears back, tail straight, hackles raised. Snarled a challenge. A sentry, a young one, and one Lara knew. Lara glanced at the cat, barely breathing, barely alive. She sniffed the air again, caught another scent beneath the blood and pheromones clouding her mind. Young. The cat had young. Wait, Lara signaled to the sentry. Guard her. If she moves, kill her. The younger wolf crouched, growled softly, eased forward an inch at a time, preparing to spring, refusing an order. Lara snarled. She should kill this wolf, but something was wrong. She shifted to skin, stood upright. Misha, stand down, she said. The sentry quivered, whined, and shook. An instant later, Misha crouched on the rocks, head lowered. I'm sorry, Sentry. I don't know why. I didn't recognize you. Never mind that now, Lara said. Guard this. Lara, Misha warned, dark eyes wide. Lara spun around. The catware had shifted, as wares often did when dying. Her hair was the same tawny color as her pelt had been, lying in curls around her shoulders. Blood still trickled from the slashes in her throat and long, sloping belly. Teeth marks scored her full breasts. Bone protruded from her right forearm. She had fought ferociously even when dying, and she was still beautiful in death. Lara stared. She had vanquished an enemy, and all she felt was crushing emptiness. Inside, her wolf howled with pain and fury. Lara knelt beside the fallen female. Who are you? Eyes the color of spring leaves, shimmering with pain, met hers. Blood trickled from the corner of her wide, generous mouth. Please. Lara leaned closer, not sure she hadn't imagined the sound, barely a breath. Who are you? Kill me, not them. Please, not them. No, Lara whispered, the words an oath. Not them. And that ends the chapter.
Wow. I didn't expect the war.
Well, I brought my two characters together in conflict.
Holy crap, conflict, Batman. That was intense.
I thought that this chapter showed the dichotomy between who they are in their animal forms and who they are in their human forms, and how there isn't all that much difference. Mm-hmm. There are just various aspects of these creatures. And I really, really wanted to put Lara with an outcast who was every bit as strong and aggressive and lethal as she was. So Lara and Raand, the cat wearer, who is actually a exiled alpha, will be the romantic pairing in this book.
Wow, that's cool. Yeah. You don't get those kind of pairings in a regular romance, I'll tell you. That's not the... And I almost stabbed her to death. Wait, no, that's not going to work. No, I like that a lot. I was worried about Lara, from the time when she turned. But I also felt that Nikki still feels that otherness as well.
She does.
So
and her story's not over. And I think that, one of the problems with having a large cast of characters is that you can only revisit some of them in every book. Mm-hmm. And I know that when I read series by other authors, I'm always looking for my favorite characters to reappear, and sometimes they don't, and I'm disappointed. But Nikki and Sophia's story is not over yet, and they do make an appearance in this book, but there's more to do with them, and I expect to revisit them in the next book, assuming there will be a next book. It's always, whenever I finish one of these, I think, oh my God, that was such hard work to write this. And, the paranormals are not as popular as the non-paranormals. That just tends to be the case, whether you're writing mainstream paranormals or gay and lesbian paranormals. And I'm always thinking, well, maybe not enough people will like this, but it tends to be gaining in popularity all the time.
Yeah, Nikki has always been one of my concerns from the start, because she understood her place as the Imperator. Mm-hmm. And she knew who she was. And what I didn't predict happening was when the Alpha Drake and then coupled with her, mm-hmm. how that would kind of displace Nikki, who was used to being the number 2.
Yeah, and it was really, and I think it's perfectly natural for her to feel that way. And I think I was thinking about relationships, where you have a very, very tight, intimate relationship. Sometimes it's sexual, sometimes it's not. And then a third is introduced and it changes the dynamic. And yet it doesn't necessarily change the original relationship. It just means a shifting and everyone kind of like finding a way to accommodate. And what I tried to show as the series progressed and tried to help Nikki understand is that the role that she played for Sylvan as her kind of like trusted right hand as the general who she relied on, that she was still critical in that role, even though, Sylvan now had a mate. And it's true that in many ways Nikki had been a stand-in, although they weren't sexual. She kind of did, offer Sylvan the friendship that only a mate could really offer the alpha. So she's a really interesting character. I like her a lot. She's still very tortured, and I like tortured characters. I like to torture characters.
Yes. I think about Nikki a lot because she doesn't know where she fits anymore, especially when she starts hosting to Lara and at one point Jody. And so she doesn't know who she is anymore completely, like where her role is. And then Drake got in the middle of a battle between, was it Dana, the other wolf? Okay. Between Nikki and Dana, who both wanted Sophia. And Drake got in the middle of it and ended up getting injured. And because she's not only the alpha's partner, but she's also pregnant with the young, that Sylvan should have just killed Nikki.
Sylvan goes nuts,
but, and then Nikki's like, I'm not even fighting it. You're right. I deserve to die. What I did was wrong. She just surrenders rather than, submitting by looking off to the side and recognizing the alpha's supremacy. She's just like, she rolled over and played dead. And it's not just about that, but she just doesn't feel like she has a place anymore. She's like, take me out of my misery, so to speak. But even towards the end, the alpha's like, don't you understand what you mean to me? Nikki, don't you know what you are in my life and how much I love you and how important you are to not just me, but also to the pack. And, Nikki's still not convinced at the end of the last book.
I think you're right. And I think part of Nikki's journey, Nikki's challenge is to, all her life, she's only seen herself in relationship to Sylvan and the pack. She valued herself based on her value to the pack. And when that seemed in her awareness to be threatened or diminished, then she was diminished in her own mind. And I think that is a problem. And that I think that the challenge for her and for me in writing her is to show her believably working through all of that. And it makes her a really interesting character and a fairly favored character. A lot of people like her, and I think a lot of us, know what it feels like to be not certain where we belong. And I was just thinking of something when you were talking about that scene, in that, the Wares are predators, and they are powerful, aggressive predators. And that's true for wolves in real life. And that's why the social hierarchy is as rigid as it is, because if there's not order, there's chaos. Mm-hmm. But unlike with true animal wolves, these are, reasoning, sentient beings who are capable of love and alliances and allegiances and fierce loyalty. And that's what, keeps this hierarchical community from being dictatorial, in the sense that, those who are more dominant don't take advantage of those who are not as dominant physically. Mm-hmm. It makes it a fair place, I think.
There are rules, including somebody has the ability, as anybody should, to deny somebody answering their call, which means mm-hmm. that they don't have to tangle with them.
Right.
And also there's a recognition of mated pairs where you even physiologically won't be attracted to being with a mated pair.
Yeah, that was really important because, that's one of the distinctions. Obviously, what I don't like in some paranormal worlds is where you can't tell the difference between the paranormal characters and the human characters. If you're going to write a paranormal character, then they ought to be different. They ought to have a different biology, and they ought to have different communities and different social structure. And, like in the wild, there's an alpha pair, and they mate with each other. And mated pairs are mated pairs. So that was important for me in writing this, to have that kind of distinction. And it makes it kind of really interesting in terms of the dynamics, but it's fun to play with.
No, I definitely agree with that one. I think one of the other realities in books, you have, the meeting, the tension, the precipice, then a resolution. But in real life, there aren't resolutions and like things that just like tear off like that. And I feel because you have the community as character, Nikki can continue to be conflicted. It's not going to be, I've fallen in love with Sophia. I'm with her, she's with me, we're all good, I know where I stand in this world.
Well, that's one of the things that we can do with an ongoing series, too, that you can't do. I mean, in a standalone romance, you pretty much have to tie up all the threads at the end, or you're going to leave the reader dissatisfied. But with this, everyone can hopefully, yes, absolutely believe in the strength of the bond between Sophia and Nikki, but the characters can still grow and change. And in fact, if your characters aren't growing and changing, your series is going to run out of steam pretty fast because it's just going to get boring and nobody's going to want to read it.
Yeah, no, I was hoping for something bland and boring today. But absolutely, thank you so much for coming on my show, Rad.
Oh, it was a great pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely. I hope to see you on the show again.
Okay, thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, bye.